The fluorescent lights buzz overhead as Marcus Chun graded papers at 11:47 p.m., his coffee long cold. When he emailed it would shatter, everything appeared in his inbox. The subject line made his blood freeze. Urgent. Emma Rodriguez. Emergency surgery required. His hands trembling. He opened the message from the hospital social worker, and the words blurred as tears filled his eyes. 8-year-old Emma, his brightest student who sat in the front row with those curious dark eyes and hand-me-down clothes, needed immediate heart surgery. Cost, $47,000. Her mother's insurance had been denied. Without the operation within 2 weeks, the little girl who reminded him so much of his own daughter would die. Marcus stared at his bank account balance on his phone screen. $18,432. It was everything he'd saved over 3 years of teaching. Every penny he'd scraped together while raising his 6-year-old daughter Lily alone after his wife's death. The money was meant for Lily's college fund, for their future, for the security they desperately needed. But as he looked at Emma's smiling face in the class photo taped to his desk, the same gap-toothed grin that had brightened his worst days, he knew there was no choice. The next morning, Marcus walked into Valley Elementary with hollow eyes and a wire transfer receipt in his pocket. He'd emptied his savings account at 6 a.m., standing in the cold bank lobby as the security guard unlocked the doors. Every dollar gone. When Emma's mother Sophia received the call that the surgery was fully funded by an anonymous donor, Marcus watched through his classroom window as she collapsed to her knees in the parking lot, sobbing with relief. Comment, hero. If you believe real teachers are heroes, and hit subscribe now if you think kindness changes everything. For 2 weeks, Marcus lived on ramen noodles and hope. He told Lily they were having adventure dinners as they ate cereal for the 3rd night in a row, her innocent laughter echoing in their tiny apartment. The surgery was successful. Emma returned to class with a scar down her chest and a smile that could light up the entire school. She hugged Marcus every morning, never knowing he was a stranger who had saved her life. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't finished with its cosmic calculations. The phone call came on a Thursday evening, while Lily practiced her spelling words at the kitchen table. Marcus recognized the gravelly voice immediately. Detective Ray Morrison, his wife's former partner from her days as a police officer. Marcus, I need to see you. Tonight, it's about Sarah. His wife had been dead for 4 years, killed in a car accident that had left him a widowed father at 31. What could possibly be urgent now? Detective Morrison sat across from Marcus in the dimly lit diner, his weathered face serious as he slid a manila envelope across the sticky table. We've been investigating a cold case, and Sarah's name came up. I think you need to know the truth about her death. Marcus's hands shook as he opened the envelope, revealing photographs and police reports he'd never seen before. The car accident wasn't random. Sarah had been investigating a money laundering operation through a local construction company. She'd been murdered. The killer had never been caught, but new evidence had surfaced. Marcus stared at the photos of the crime scene, seeing details a sanitized version had hidden from him. His wife hadn't died instantly. She'd fought. She'd tried to get home to him and baby Lily. The official report had been altered, witnesses silenced, the investigation buried beneath layers of corruption. Who? Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the diner's buzzing neon sign. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and share this with someone who believes justice matters. Rodriguez Construction, Morrison said grimly. The owner's name is Eduardo Rodriguez. He's Emma's grandfather. The world tilted sideways. The little girl he'd saved, whose smile had brought light to his darkest days, was the granddaughter of the man who had orchestrated his wife's murder. Marcus gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, as the cosmic irony crashed over him like a tidal wave. He'd given his life savings to save the family member of the person who had destroyed his family. That night, Marcus sat in his daughter's bedroom, watching her sleep peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in the moonlight streaming through their threadbare curtains. The rage burned in his stomach like acid. He could expose everything. Eduardo Rodriguez would finally face justice for Sarah's murder. The construction empire built on blood money would crumble, but Emma would lose her grandfather, the man who'd raised her after her father abandoned them. Sophia would lose the only family support she had. And the little girl with the repaired heart would learn that her life had been saved by the husband of the woman her grandfather killed. The next morning brought another shock that would test every principle Marcus had ever held. Sophia Rodriguez appeared at his classroom door during lunch break, her eyes red from crying, clutching a thick envelope. "Mr. Chun," she whispered, "I know it was you. I know you paid for Emma's surgery." Marcus started to protest, but she held up her hand. "My father told me what he did to your wife. He's dying, Mr. Chun. Pancreatic cancer. He has maybe 2 months left, and the guilt is eating him alive." Sophia's voice broke as she continued. "He wants to confess everything to the police, but first, he wants to give you this." She placed the envelope on his desk with trembling fingers. Inside were documents transferring ownership of 3 apartment buildings to Marcus, worth over $2 million. It's everything he can liquidate quickly. He says it's not enough to bring Sarah back, but maybe it can give you and Lily the future Sarah would have wanted. Marcus stared at the papers, his mind reeling. Justice served on a silver platter, financial security beyond his wildest dreams, and the man who'd shattered his world dying slowly and painfully. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. "He wants to tell Emma the truth before he confesses," Sophia whispered. "He wants her to know what kind of man her abuelo really is." What happens next will absolutely shock you. But first, hit subscribe if you believe forgiveness is stronger than revenge. That evening, Marcus found himself sitting across from Eduardo Rodriguez in a sterile hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and death. The man who had haunted his nightmares for 4 years was nothing like he'd imagined. Gaunt and yellow-skinned, Eduardo was a shadow of the powerful construction mogul he'd once been. Tubes snaked from his arms, and his breathing was labored, each word a struggle against the cancer devouring him from within. "I've been watching you," Eduardo rasped, his English heavily accented but clear. "For 4 years, I've watched you raise your daughter alone, watched you struggle, watched you become the teacher my granddaughter adores." He paused, coughing violently into a tissue spotted with blood. "When Sophia told me what you did, paying for Emma's surgery with your own money, I knew God was punishing me in the cruelest way possible." Marcus had prepared for this moment, rehearsed the angry words he would hurl at his wife's killer. But sitting here, looking at this dying man who clearly carried the weight of his sins, the rage fell hollow. "Why?" was all he could manage. Eduardo's eyes filled with tears. "Your wife?" She was getting too close. "My lawyer said she had enough evidence to destroy everything I'd built, to send me to prison for life. I panicked. I hired 2 men to scare her, to steal her files. They weren't supposed to hurt her." His voice cracked. "But she fought them. She fought so hard, and one of them lost control. When I found out what really happened, I wanted to kill them both, but it was too late. Your Sarah was gone." The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of machines keeping Eduardo alive. Marcus thought about Sarah's fierce determination, how she'd fought for justice, even when it cost her everything. She would have fought those men with everything she had, trying to get home to her family. "I'm dying," Eduardo continued, "but my granddaughter's alive because of you. How do I make sense of that? How do I face God knowing that the man whose life I destroyed saved the most precious thing in my world?" Before Marcus could respond, the door opened softly and Emma entered with Sophia. The 8-year-old looked tiny in her hospital gown, still weak from her recent surgery, but insistent on seeing her abuelo. She climbed carefully onto the bed and curled up next to Eduardo, her small hand resting over his heart. "Abuelo," she whispered, "Mama says you're very sick. Are you scared?" Eduardo's face crumpled as he looked down at his granddaughter, then across at Marcus. "No, Mija," he whispered back. "I'm not scared anymore. I have something important to tell you. Something about Mr. Chun and why he's such a special teacher. Only people with true hearts will understand what happens next. Subscribe now if you believe in the power of forgiveness." Marcus watched as Eduardo gently explained to Emma that Mr. Chun was the anonymous donor who had saved her life. The little girl's eyes went wide with wonder, and she looked across the room at Marcus with pure adoration. But then Eduardo's voice grew heavy as he prepared to tell her about Sarah, about his terrible mistake, about how sometimes good people get hurt by scared, bad decisions. "Stop," Marcus said suddenly, standing from his chair. The word came out sharper than he intended, and everyone in the room turned to look at him. He walked to the bed where the dying man held his granddaughter, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Emma looked up at him with those trusting dark eyes, the same eyes that had motivated him to empty his savings account. "Emma," Marcus said softly, kneeling beside the bed, "your abuelo was just about to tell you that he and I have become friends. He wants to help me and Lily have a better life, just like I was able to help you get your heart fixed." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but Emma's smile was radiant. Eduardo stared at Marcus in confusion and growing understanding. "But the police," he whispered. "The confession." Marcus met his eyes steadily. "You're dying, Eduardo. You have maybe 2 months left. Emma doesn't need to know her abuelo was anything other than a man who loved her and wanted to make things right before he died. Sophia doesn't need to lose the only support system she has. And I don't need my daughter to grow up knowing that money came from her mother's killer." The silence in the room was deafening. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth as she understood what Marcus was offering. Eduardo's eyes filled with tears of disbelief. Emma, oblivious to the life-changing decision being made around her, snuggled deeper against her grandfather's chest. "Justice," Eduardo whispered. "Justice is you living with what you did every day until cancer takes you," Marcus replied. "Justice is Emma growing up kind and good, never touched by the violence that took her grandmother and my wife. Justice is breaking the cycle. Calm and forgiven if you understand that some choices transcend revenge." Eduardo Rodriguez died 6 weeks later, surrounded by his family, having never confessed his crimes to anyone except Marcus. He left behind a granddaughter who remembered him as a loving abuelo who helped her favorite teacher, and a daughter who slowly began to understand the weight of the gift they'd been given. Marcus used Eduardo's final bequest to set up college funds for both Emma and Lily, to move his family to a better neighborhood, and to establish a scholarship program at Valley Elementary for children facing medical emergencies. The money couldn't bring Sarah back, but could honor her memory by protecting other children, other families. Marcus kept one photograph in the police file, a picture of his wife at her desk, determined and fierce in her pursuit of justice. He framed it and placed it in his new home office, not as a reminder of vengeance, but as inspiration for the kind of courage it takes to choose healing over hatred. 2 years later, Marcus stood at the back of the auditorium watching Emma Rodriguez deliver her 5th grade graduation speech. She spoke about kindness, about how one person's generosity had changed her entire life, about growing up to be a teacher just like Mr. Chan. In the audience, Sophia wiped away tears, healthy and strong, having used her inheritance to go back to school and become a nurse. Lily, now 8 and thriving in her new school, tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "Emma's speech is making everyone cry. Why are you smiling?" Marcus looked down at his daughter, this beautiful little girl, who would never know how close they had come to a very different kind of life. Because, sweetheart, sometimes the best way to honor someone we love is to love someone else, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. That night, as Marcus tucked Lily into bed in their comfortable home, she asked a question he'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "Daddy, will you tell me about Mama? The real stories, not just the picture stories." Marcus sat on the edge of her bed and began to speak about Sarah Chun, the police officer who fought for justice, who believed in protecting the innocent, who would have loved the choice he made in that hospital room. He told Lily about courage that looked like kindness, about strength that chose mercy, about a love so powerful it could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of healing. Share this story with someone who needs to believe that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to write a different ending. The last thing Marcus did each night was stand in his office, looking at Sarah's photograph. "I hope you understand," he whispered to her image. "I couldn't save you, but I could save her. I couldn't bring you justice, but I could bring them peace. I couldn't change what happened, but I could choose what happens next." Outside his window, the neighborhood kids played in the safe streets their scholarship program had helped improve. Emma Rodriguez would start middle school in the fall, her repaired heart beating strong and steady. Sophia worked the night shift at the children's hospital, saving other people's babies. And Lilychin fell asleep each night, knowing she was loved beyond measure, never knowing the price of that love, never needing to. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy. Sometimes it's saving them from becoming what hurt you. Sometimes justice isn't punishment. Sometimes justice is a little girl with a gap-toothed smile who grows up believing the world is full of people who would empty their savings to save a stranger. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with pain is transform it into purpose. Marcus Chun had learned that heroes aren't the people who get their revenge. Heroes are the people who choose love when love seems impossible, who build bridges instead of walls, who understand that the most profound way to honor the dead is to protect the living, even when the living carry the names of those who cause the dying. Especially then, the circle was complete, but it wasn't a circle of vengeance. It was a circle of grace.